The sun was already high that Saturday morning when Cynthia opened the door of her Lekki apartment. Her hair was unkempt, still tied in a scarf from the night before. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially not her. Standing at the door, dressed in a neat purple lace blouse and wrapper, was the one woman Cynthia had spent the last 2 years badmouthing, her mother-in-law, Sandra. But this time, the woman wasn't just visiting. She held a modest brown leather bag and smiled faintly, hopeful. "Good morning, my daughter. I just came in from the island. Before she could finish, Cynthia's face hardened. No smile, no welcome, not even a nod. She turned around without a word and walked inside. Sandra hesitated, then slowly stepped in, her eyes roaming the familiar corridor. Cynthia came out again, this time holding a bucket filled with dirty mop water, and then, without blinking, she splashed it on Sandra. The water soaked the older woman's entire body. Her scarf clung to her scalp. Her wrapper stuck to her knees. Dirty suds and streaks of grime trickled down her once elegant blouse. "You witch!" Cynthia screamed. "You've come here again to disturb our peace, haven't you? Must you keep being a burden? Do you think we don't have enough problems already?" Sandra didn't say a word. She only stood still, trembling, but not from fear. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. "You should be in the village selling pepper and tomatoes like other women of your age. You're just wandering around, calling yourself a mother, always appearing uninvited like a curse. Is it because we now work at Johnson's group of companies that you want to come over and start eating from us? Well, go back to wherever you came from." Sandra slowly brought out her phone and started recording. Cynthia noticed. She laughed bitterly. "Record well. Send it to your church people. Let them see what you really are. You're not welcome here." Still not saying a word, Sandra turned and walked away, soaked, humiliated, her leather bag dangling limply in her hand. But her heart was no longer broken. It was now hardening. She returned to her hotel suite, the presidential suite at Oriental Hotel. She changed into a clean black gown, applied her makeup, and sat down at the window overlooking the city of Lagos. And then, with calm fingers, she sent the video to her son, David. The message read, "Thank you for telling your wife I am worthless and a burden. I finally accepted it. From today onward, you are no longer my son. I hope your new family brings you the joy you value so much, Sandra." David saw the message while on a business trip in Abuja. He played the video, leaned back in the hotel chair, then tossed his phone on the bed. He hissed loudly, "Finally, the old woman won't disturb me again." But what David didn't know, what he had no idea about, was that the woman he just disowned was not only his mother, she was now the CEO of the Billionaire company he and his wife worked for, and the storm she was about to unleash that would change everything. 3 days before the incident at the house, Sandra Johnson stood inside the glass-walled boardroom of the Johnson Group of Companies headquarters. She wore a deep blue skirt suit, subtle diamond studs on her ears, and her naturally graying hair tied in a sleek bun. The air smelled of fresh polish and air conditioning. Seated before her were the regional heads, financial advisors, legal directors, and PR teams, none of whom knew the full story behind the new CEO they were meeting. She smiled calmly, holding the room like she had done countless times behind the scenes. For 2 years, Sandra had quietly monitored the company. Her late father, Chief Anthony Johnson, had left behind. He had passed with one instruction, whispered into her ear before his final breath. "Let them earn your presence. Hide in plain sight. Then, when the time is right, claim what's yours." And that's what she did. She had sent in Benjamin, her son, as an intern with no surname disclosed. He rose on his own merit. She then joined several board meetings disguised as an anonymous investor representative. Only the family lawyer knew her real identity. And now, the time had come. "As we discussed," Sandra said, addressing the boardroom, "the company needs a cultural reset. We've spent years growing financially, but we must now grow ethically. We need to lead by character, not just capital." Heads nodded. Notes were taken. That was 3 days ago. Now, Sandra sat again, this time in a dimmer room, facing a large screen. The media team cued the final video for tomorrow's press conference. The announcement of her true identity, her new position as CEO, her pledge to reform the values within the company. Her face remained calm, but her heart? It ached. Not for the company, for her son. The son who once used to bring her flowers on her birthday. The one who knelt to thank her after graduating from university. The son she sacrificed for, only to be pushed aside for a wife who never even gave her a chance. Sandra took a deep breath and leaned back. God, help me not to use power to punish, she whispered. But let justice speak. At home, David was lounging on the sofa when Cynthia barged in from the market. She dropped the shopping bags with a thud. I saw something strange on social media, she said, panting. What again? He replied lazily, scrolling through his phone. There's a press conference scheduled for tomorrow at the Johnson Group. They're unveiling the new CEO publicly for the first time. They say she's been hiding her identity for 2 years. David raised a brow. Why all the secrecy? I don't know, Cynthia shrugged, but there's a buzz. She's supposedly from a powerful lineage. Billionaire heiress type. David laughed. Well, it's definitely not your mother-in-law. Cynthia rolled her eyes. Don't even mention that woman. I still feel disgusted thinking of her face at our door. So pathetic. But even as she said it, something gnawed inside her. That video, the one Sandra recorded, had now been shared subtly on WhatsApp statuses and Telegram groups. A few co-workers had already seen it. Who was that woman? One of them asked her the day before. Oh, just a poor relative. Cynthia had lied. The next morning arrived with Lagos buzzing. Media vans lined up at the entrance of Johnson Group's Ikoyi branch. Staff filed in, phones recording, whispering excitedly about the mystery woman who now owned everything. David and Cynthia were there too, seated near the back of the press hall. They had no idea what was about to happen. The company's PRO stepped forward. We thank you all for joining us today. It is with great honor that we introduce the new CEO of Johnson Group of Companies. A soft murmur swept across the room. Madam Sandra Johnson. And there she was, walking out gracefully in a cream suit and black heels. Cameras flashed. The hall fell silent. David's eyes widened. Cynthia dropped her water bottle. The woman who had stood at their door just days ago, drenched in dirty water, now stood before the world, crowned in power. Cynthia's hands trembled. Her eyes darted between Sandra and David. No, 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 this is not happening, she whispered. David swallowed hard. He could feel his heart thudding. That can't be. Sandra took the mic. Her voice was calm, firm. I stand here today, not to flex my power, but to uphold a legacy. This company was built by my father, Chief Johnson, a man who taught me the value of dignity, even in silence. For 2 years, I've walked these halls, watched from a distance, and tested the hearts of men. She paused. Her eyes scanned the hall, and locked eyes with David. I've seen those who shine when no one is watching, and those who rot behind polished smiles. But from now on, Johnson Group will be led by integrity, starting from the top to the least staff member. The room erupted in applause, but David and Cynthia sat frozen, shaking, confused. An hour later, in her executive office, Sandra met with the top HR managers. Place David and Cynthia on probation, she said firmly. Monitor their behavior for 6 months. No special treatment, no sacking. Just eyes on them. And don't mention I'm his mother. Let their true selves continue to show. She looked out the window, watching as David and Cynthia stood below, staring up at the building in silent shame. The same building they once bragged about working in. The same woman they mocked, now sat at its peak. Justice didn't need noise. It only needed time. The silence in the apartment was loud. Cynthia sat at the edge of their bed, her eyes glassy, still in the same clothes from the day before. David hadn't spoken to her since they returned from the press conference. He sat in the living room, staring blankly at the black TV screen, his own reflection, staring back at him in shame. David. Cynthia's voice trembled, barely above audible. Say something. He didn't respond. David, please. What just happened? That was your mother? Slowly, he turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes startled her. You poured dirty water on my mother, he said slowly. You called her useless, a witch. You mocked her in our own home. You shamed the woman who gave me everything I have. Cynthia stood up suddenly, her voice rising, defensive. Don't you dare pin this on me. You were the one who always said she was a burden. You told me she never did anything for you. You told me she was always disturbing you with her old stories and emotional blackmail. I was only reacting to what you told me. I never told you to treat her like trash, David shouted, standing too. She came to visit, and you humiliated her like a common beggar. Cynthia's voice cracked. But you were happy when she left, weren't you? You told me to ignore her calls. You said we should live our lives and not let her interfere. You lied to me, David. You never told me your grandfather was Chief Johnson. You never told me your family owned that empire. David sank back onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. I didn't know, he muttered. I swear, I didn't know. She never told me. I thought we were poor. I thought she was just some lonely widow trying to hang on to me. Cynthia's knees buckled. She sat slowly on the floor. Then why didn't she tell you? She whispered. David looked up, his voice full of regret. Because she wanted to raise me right. She wanted me to value hard work, not riches. That's why she never told me about the inheritance. That's why she let me work at her company without revealing who she was. She wanted me to find my way. They both sat in silence. Now she's cut me off completely, David said. She told me I'm no longer her son. Cynthia's lip quivered. You think she'll forgive us? David stared blankly. I don't know. At Johnson Group, things had changed. David and Cynthia were now under tight observation. Every report they submitted was triple-checked. Every conversation they had in the office felt like it had ears. The once friendly colleagues now kept their distance. The whispers were loud, the stares sharp. Everyone had seen the video. Everyone knew the story. The woman humiliated in her own son's house was now the CEO. During lunch breaks, David ate alone. Cynthia no longer strutted through the hallways in her high heels and designer perfume. Now, she dressed simply and kept to herself. Humiliation had a way of reshaping pride. One afternoon, 6 weeks after the press conference, Sandra called Benjamin into her office. He entered, still nervous around his mother in her CEO role. You've done well, Sandra smiled gently. I've been watching you. Your department is the only one that's met its targets consistently this quarter. Benjamin looked down. I want to make you proud, Mum. You already have, she said, standing. You remind me of who your brother used to be before he changed. Benjamin sighed. Do you think he regrets it? Sandra turned toward the large window, arms crossed. I know he does, but regret is a heavy thing. It doesn't always lead to repentance. Benjamin hesitated. Will you ever forgive him? Sandra didn't answer immediately. When she finally did, her voice was soft. I forgave him the moment he was born, but I can't trust him again. Not yet. Not while he's still blind. Meanwhile, David and Cynthia tried everything. They sent gifts, flowers, long apology letters. They begged Benjamin to intervene. They visited the office to see Sandra only to be turned away by her assistant every time. She's not taking any visitors, the assistant would say firmly. Tell her it's her son, David once pleaded. She's aware. She said no. The pain of rejection started to eat David from inside. He lost interest in meetings, missed deadlines. HR called him in for performance reviews. The probation was choking him. He had become a shell of himself. And Cynthia? The shame of what she did began to haunt her dreams. She would wake up sweating at night, hearing Sandra's voice calling her name, only to remember she wasn't calling anymore. One Sunday morning, Cynthia went to church alone. For the first time in years, she knelt at the altar and sobbed. She wasn't just crying because she was afraid of losing her job, or because she'd been exposed. She was crying because deep inside, she knew. She had been cruel to a woman who never raised her voice against her. One evening, Sandra sat alone in her penthouse, flipping through old photo albums. She stopped at one picture, David at age 5, holding her hand tightly, his face wide with joy. A tear dropped onto the page. The knock on the door was soft. Her assistant entered with hesitation. "Ma, I know you said no visitors, but someone is at the lobby downstairs." "Who?" "Your son. He's been sitting there for over 3 hours." Sandra looked up slowly. "He's not alone," the assistant added. "His wife is with him. She's been crying." Sandra closed the album quietly. "Tell them I'll send a driver to take them home." "Ma? That's all. They need time to sit in their guilt, not comfort." The assistant nodded and walked away. Back at the lobby, David sat with his hands folded. Cynthia leaned on his shoulder, silent tears on her face. The security guard approached them gently. "Madam said she's sending a car. You should go." David stood slowly, his heart heavy. As they walked out of the building, Cynthia whispered, "I think we've lost her forever." David didn't answer, but inside, something was growing. Not just regret, but a desperate, burning desire. 2 months had passed since the press conference, and yet every day felt heavier than the last for David and Cynthia. They had thought time would heal things, that Sandra would eventually soften, but it hadn't happened. Not once had she returned a message, a call, or a visit. It was as though she had erased them from her life, and the more they waited, the worse the silence became. It wasn't just about losing her love, it was the shame that now followed them like shadows. In the office, everyone watched them. No one said anything, but the judgment was always there. It showed in how conversations died when they entered a room. It showed in the way even junior staff now refused to smile at them. David had once walked into this office with his chest out, his tie perfectly adjusted, confident and loud. Now, he walked in with his head down, hoping nobody would see him. Cynthia had it worse. Not only was she being closely monitored, but she could hear the whispers behind her back. "That's the woman who poured dirty water on her billionaire mother-in-law. I heard she called the CEO a witch to her face. If not for probation, they would have been fired the next day." And worse than any of it was what began to happen at home. David had changed. He barely spoke, barely smiled. He would come home, toss his bag on the floor, and collapse on the couch in silence. Sometimes, he would sit by the window for hours, just staring at the road, watching cars pass like he was waiting for something that would never come. Cynthia tried to act like everything was okay. She would cook his favorite meals, dress up like she used to when they first got married, even tried to joke like before, but he never laughed. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. She found him sitting on the balcony in the dark. She stepped outside slowly, wrapped her shawl tighter around her. "David," she said softly, "can we talk?" He didn't respond. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Talk to me. I feel like I've lost you too." David finally looked up at her, eyes tired and distant. "You didn't lose me," he said. "You broke me." Cynthia blinked, stunned. "I broke you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded slowly. "You broke the part of me that believed we were building something honest. You didn't just hurt my mother, Cynthia. You destroyed the only relationship that really mattered to me, and you did it with pride." Cynthia knelt beside him, grabbing his hand. "I'm sorry, David. I didn't know. I was angry. I was misled. I thought she was just." "Worthless?" He finished it for her. "No," she whispered. "I was wrong. I've never hated myself more in my entire life." They sat there in silence for a while. Then Cynthia whispered the words that made David's heart twist. Maybe this is why we haven't been able to have a child." He looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" She wiped her tears. "Maybe God is holding back. Maybe it's punishment." David sighed, rubbing his face with his palms. "I don't know, Cynthia. All I know is nothing feels right anymore." Meanwhile, Sandra was thriving. The company was growing at a record pace. Investors were calling daily, requesting meetings, eager to work with the invisible CEO, who had now become a global mystery turned legend. Business magazines praised her approach to leadership, calling it quiet power with moral depth. She had won the admiration of the world, but not the peace of her own heart. Every night, she would sit by her window, holding an old picture of David as a baby, the video of him laughing, barely a toddler, calling her, "Mama, up, up," would play in her mind. And then like a jolt, the memory of the dirty water crashing over her body would come rushing back. The sting of those words, that look of hatred in Cynthia's eyes. And, worse, the silence from her son after he watched the video. She still hadn't deleted the message he sent after her text that day, the message where he simply hissed and dismissed her pain. That message burned more than the bucket of water. And so, even though her heart longed to forgive, her pride whispered, "They chose their path. Let them walk it." Benjamin had tried, over and over, to mediate. He would bring her tea and gently say, "Mum, please, just see them one more time." But Sandra would only shake her head. "I gave them my presents once. They spat on it." Still, Benjamin didn't give up. One afternoon, he walked into her office, holding a small envelope. "What's that?" Sandra asked. He placed it on her desk. "A letter. From Cynthia. She sent it to my apartment." Sandra raised an eyebrow but didn't touch it. "She says she's sorry," Benjamin continued. "She says she never knew a heart could feel so much shame. She wrote that she wakes up every day praying you'll forgive her, even if you never speak to her again." Sandra looked at the envelope for a long time, then picked it up. She didn't open it right away, but she didn't throw it away either. Later that week, Sandra went to the orphanage her company supported. She spent time with the children, laughing, donating school supplies, and even dancing with them during playtime. And then, in the middle of the noise and joy, a little girl tugged at her dress. "Mama," the girl said with big, curious eyes. "Why are you sad inside?" Sandra bent down slowly, stunned. "Sad? What makes you say that?" The girl shrugged. "You smile with your mouth, but your eyes are crying." Sandra felt something inside her crack. That night, she sat at her desk, opened Cynthia's letter, and read it in full. By the end, her hands were shaking, but her heart was warm. There was no begging in the letter, no manipulation, just sorrow, deep, raw, honest sorrow. And it pierced something inside Sandra that had stayed locked for months. The next morning, Cynthia woke up to find a small envelope slid under their apartment door. She picked it up with trembling hands. Inside was a card, elegant and plain. All it said was, "You may remain in the company, but the door to my heart stays closed for now. Sandra." Cynthia fell to the floor, clutching it to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't hatred either. For the first time, it felt like a fragile, thin thread had been handed to them. And maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. The rain had poured steadily all morning. Lagos traffic was crawling, and grey clouds sat stubbornly above the skyline. But inside the Johnson Group headquarters, everything was quiet and bright. Cynthia stood in the restroom mirror, adjusting her blouse for the third time. Her makeup was light, and her expression was softer than it had been in months. Today marked the end of their 6-month probation. No one had said anything about what would happen next. Would they be asked to leave quietly? Would Sandra finally speak to them? Would she continue ignoring their existence? Cynthia didn't know, but she had stopped expecting anything. Instead, she had chosen to change. She now arrived early to work, helped junior staff, attended trainings, and even led a project that secured a small client account. It wasn't about earning Sandra's approval anymore. She simply wanted to be better, less entitled, more aware. And David, though slower to adjust, was changing too. He had begun seeing a therapist. He apologized to former colleagues he'd once looked down on. He even donated anonymously to 3 women-led businesses his mother used to support. The change wasn't dramatic, but it was genuine. Still, Sandra said nothing. She never called, never visited. Not a word beyond the simple card that Cynthia still kept folded in her purse. That Friday, at 4 p.m., an email arrived. To David. Cynthia. Subject: closed. Door evaluation. Time: 5 p.m. Location: 17th floor. CEO's private office. Signed, Board Secretary. Cynthia's heart jumped into her throat. Her hands trembled as she read it. David had received the same message and stood frozen at his desk. "Should we go together?" Cynthia asked him, her voice small. David nodded, even though every step toward the 17th floor felt like walking toward judgment. The elevator doors opened to silence. No assistants. No board members. Just the sound of their own footsteps as they approached the private executive wing. Sandra's door stood closed, elegant and cold. David knocked twice. "Come in," came the voice from inside. They entered slowly. Sandra was seated behind her desk, dressed in a deep green gown. Her glasses were perched on her nose, and she was writing something in a black notebook. She didn't look up. They stood for what felt like forever. Finally, she closed the notebook, removed her glasses, and looked at them. Her expression was unreadable. "You've both completed your probation," she said flatly. "I've read the reports, monitored your performance, reviewed your decisions. You've made progress." Cynthia opened her mouth to speak, but Sandra raised a hand. "Let me finish." They both stood still. "You are not the same woman who poured water on me," Sandra said, eyes fixed on Cynthia. "You are not the same man who hissed and dismissed me as a burden," she added, eyes turning to David. "But let's be clear, those people still live inside you, and they can return if you stop watching your heart." A silence followed, heavy and honest. "I won't fire you," Sandra continued. "You've worked hard, you've grown, and I believe in giving people space to change." David swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you, Ma." Sandra paused, her voice lowered. "But forgiveness is not a button you press. It's a process. And while the company may continue to employ you, my heart still aches." Cynthia's eyes welled up. "Ma, we truly regret what we did. I don't even have the right to ask for anything, but I need you to know. I've changed." Sandra finally stood, walked around the desk, and faced them. "You both took something from me," she said quietly. "Not just dignity, but trust. And trust takes time to rebuild." "I understand," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong, Mum. I was deeply, deeply wrong. I let pride and ignorance blind me. And the worst part is, I didn't see your love for what it was." There was a pause, a long, fragile silence. And then, slowly, Sandra stepped forward. She reached into her drawer, pulled out an old photo David, barely 12, sitting beside her with a small cake between them. She handed it to him. "I kept this in my drawer every day during your probation," she said. "Sometimes I would stare at it and wonder, where did that boy go?" David's hands shook as he took it, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm still here," he whispered, "and I want to come home." Cynthia stepped closer, her voice soft. "Even if you never forgive me, Ma, please, don't let my foolishness rob David of his mother." Sandra looked at her for a long moment. Then, with tears in her own eyes, she said the words neither of them expected. "I already forgave you," Cynthia gasped. Sandra continued. "I forgave you the day you sent that letter. I didn't respond because I needed you both to learn. Not just apologize, but live changed lives." David dropped to his knees. "Mum, please, I don't want a title. I don't need inheritance. I just want my mother back." Sandra knelt down with him, placed a hand on his cheek. "I never left," she said softly. Cynthia dropped beside them too, sobbing quietly. And for the first time in nearly a year, the air between them was not cold, not tense, but warm, honest, healing. Weeks passed, things improved, slowly. Sandra invited David and Cynthia to dinner, nothing fancy, just jollof rice and fried plantains with chicken at her home. They laughed, shared stories, and for the first time, Cynthia helped clean the dishes without being asked. Their marriage also changed. They spoke more, prayed more, and surprisingly, one morning, 2 pink lines appeared on a test strip. Cynthia screamed from the bathroom, and David came running. They stared at it together, in disbelief. Tears streamed down her face as she held onto him tightly. "We're having a baby." David looked up at the ceiling, smiling with a heart so full it could burst. God gave us a second chance. At the company's annual gala, Sandra stood on stage to give her closing remarks. The room was packed with executives, partners, and staff. But tonight, she had more than business on her heart. "I've learned something this year," she said into the mic. "That power isn't in money or titles. It's in grace, in patience, in giving people room to grow even after they've failed you." She looked at David and Cynthia, seated in the front row. "I was hurt deeply, but I've also been healed deeply. And sometimes healing doesn't come from punishment. It comes from love." The room erupted in applause, and as she stepped down from the stage, David stood to hug her this time, not as an employee or a stranger, but as a son coming back home. 8 months later, David and Cynthia welcomed a baby girl who they named Sandra, after David's mother, a woman who chose to forgive them despite what they did to her. They continued to raise their child and live as a happy family, but the lessons remained with them, guiding their every step in life. What is your view about this story? Where are you watching from? If you like this story, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories.